We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. Having vetoed a ceasefire resolution at the United Nations on 3 separate occasions, the Biden administration is now blaming Hamas for the absence of a ceasefire. On the eve of Ramadan, more than 30,000 people have been killed in Gaza, 75,000 have been wounded. People in Gaza are literally starving to death. Welcome to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today, we're talking with Layan Fuleihan. She is a popular educator, organizer, the education director at the People's Forum, and an editor at 1804 Books. She's also been a lead organizer in the mass demonstrations under the banner of Shut It Down for Palestine. Layan, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're in this Alice in Wonderland world, Layan, reality turned upside down. The Biden administration, standing almost alone in the whole world, has used the U.S. veto power as a permanent member of the UN Security Council to stop a ceasefire resolution. Now, as President Biden prepares to make his State of the Union address, very important for his potential re-election bid, the Biden administration is blaming Hamas for the absence of a ceasefire. Anyway, let's start there. I want to get your take.
It's really such a hypocritical approach. I mean, the United States has been, like you said, primarily the force blocking a ceasefire. They're not proposing a ceasefire, they're proposing a truce. And I think the amount of both public pressure inside the United States and international isolation that they're suffering from has forced them to try to now start adopting the language of ceasefire, saying that there's a ceasefire deal on the table, that they want a ceasefire, and they're using that as a way to put the blame on Hamas, whose position has been quite firm throughout the past weeks of negotiations. They've been saying a truce is not sufficient. What we want is a permanent ceasefire. And so the United States is trying to manipulate language, I think primarily directed at their own public, to make it seem like the United States is on the side of a ceasefire. But really what they're proposing is a truce. Even in the United Nations, their draft proposal, has not been amended to include a ceasefire. It's still specifying a 6-week truce. So it's a very hypocritical position of the United States and quite manipulative in the arena of the media.
Well, we're going to talk about what Hamas wants. What is Hamas actually saying at the negotiating table? People, especially in the United States, don't know, because if they're getting their news from the mainstream media, they're not being told. It's all demonization, caricaturing Hamas, not representing what the real position is. So we're going to talk about that, and I know you have been following that quite carefully. I'm glad you mentioned that Biden is responding, at least in large part, to the domestic public opinion. We were here, Layan, I was with you and 50,000 other people in a pouring rain in New York City on March 2nd. Millions of people all around the world, from Chicago to Havana, Cuba, people in the hundreds of thousands, literally in aggregate, millions of people saying stop the demand a ceasefire, stop the genocide. So Biden is facing a lot of reaction. On Tuesday, people went to the polls in the Democratic Party primaries, and in large numbers, people voted uncommitted as part of that mass electoral movement, saying we're not going to vote for Biden, we're going to vote uncommitted. These are people who voted for Biden in 2020. I mean, in Minnesota, more than 20% of the people voted uncommitted. That's a stand against genocide. So yeah, that's happening. I want to go to a news clip about what the U.S. has done at the United Nations, the contemptible position that the United States has adopted at the UN. This is why the American people are rising up right now against Biden, and why the rest of the world is condemning the Biden administration, not for supporting genocide, for being a partner in genocide. Let's listen to this news clip.
Resolution before the UN Security Council to call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza was shot down today. The only country out of the 15-member council to vote against it, the U.S. Eyewitness News reporter Darla Miles with more on the decision from the newsroom. Darla.
Well, David, this is the third time since the October 7th attacks that the U.S. has used its veto power to kill a resolution that calls for an immediate ceasefire. And after the vote this morning, the U.S. and the UN Security Council have been strongly condemned by other countries on the council for inaction so far.
Yeah, the American people are upset, Layan. People around the world, people in the Middle East in particular, very, very upset. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, it's really a terrible role that the United States is playing. They actually have the position to be able to put significant pressure on the Israelis and to actually push the negotiations forward. Their insistence on not actually pushing for a permanent ceasefire, I think we can talk about it in more detail, but is really showing and demonstrating the fact that they're using the negotiations not to actually end the genocide, but to buy Israel more time. They're very concerned with what's going to happen during the month of Ramadan. Both the U.S. and Israel is concerned about regional escalation during this month, when people are going to have a heightened commitment, and they're going to be recommitting in many ways to the Palestinian cause. And they're now hoping that they can buy time over the next couple of weeks, next 6 weeks in particular, to get the remaining hostages out of Gaza and then set the stage for completing the objectives of the Israeli assault, genocidal assault on the occupied Gaza territory. So it's something that is on display for the world. I mean, I think what has been so decisive has been the fact that the mass mobilizations over the past 5 months have made it so that the simple wordplay that the White House and Biden administration is using to try to divert and distract and make it seem like they're picking up the popular position, and in fact that they are the ones that are trying to end the genocide, is not actually going to work, because people have been activated and alerted to the U.S. role in this whole genocide, and they have developed both the information, the consciousness, and also have been getting their information from sources other than the White House and their, the mainstream capitalist media. And so it's really an untenable position for the United States to be in. It's something that was demonstrated by yesterday's Super Tuesday with these unprecedented numbers of uncommitted votes. Biden is really backed into a corner, and Netanyahu, but we're really at a critical stage because, as you, with your opening words, Brian, the situation in Gaza is really, really difficult. The impending famine, there's been many people, especially children, who have died of malnutrition and dehydration. And so the situation is really, really dire. The U.S. is playing only a role that is still supportive of the Israeli occupation. And it's quite critical and quite significant that public opinion is still recognizing that.
Well, I want people to go beyond wordplay, as you aptly put it, and try to understand the politics of the war, which also means to understand the politics of the negotiations, the politics of the different parties. What does Hamas want? What does Israel want? What does the U.S. want? This has to be analyzed. People can't look at these events and this dialogue or these words superficially. It's important that people kind of understand what they really mean, sort of reading between the lines. What Hamas has not agreed to so far, it hasn't said no, but what they haven't agreed to is essentially an Israeli proposal, which is what the Americans want. America wants Hamas to agree to an Israeli proposal, and Hamas has its own proposal. So let's just talk about these different proposals. First, let's talk about and focus on what Hamas wants.
Sure. So Hamas yesterday delivered what it's calling its final response. And just to note, Hamas has been very willing to engage in the negotiating process. In fact, it's been the Israeli delegation that has wavered and actually withdrew from the negotiations. And so they were not even present at the negotiating table yesterday when this was delivered. And so Hamas now, after some rounds of going back and forth, and actually we talked about it on the show a couple weeks ago, now the final response is pretty significant. Hamas is insisting, first of all, that this agreement leads to a permanent ceasefire, not simply a truce. Secondly, that the cessation of military operations would occur 1 week before any exchange of hostages happens. In fact, that Hamas is saying that they need the military operations and assaults to stop in order to gather their forces and then complete the hostage exchange. They are saying also that they are not going to accept any partial withdrawing of the Israeli occupation forces. What they are asking for, and they have been very clear and firm on, is that there would be a full withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. And that from the first day of the beginning of the deal, there would be no restriction on the entry of aid, including the moving of aid within the occupied Gaza territory. Specifically, that the checkpoints and security squares and the different kinds of things that the Israelis have set up to manage movement within Gaza, that they be removed and that aid is able to flow freely throughout both the north and the south, that people are allowed to return to their homes and their region of Gaza without restriction, in particular to the north. And then that there is a specific list of they are asking for the exchange of, in exchange for the hostages that are still remaining in the Gaza in under Hamas control. And that list of prisoners would include certain high-profile people who are facing multiple life sentences or really high sentences, people that Israel has refused to release before in the past, like Marwan Barghouti, Ahmed Saadat, and others, and Abdullah Barghouti and Ibrahim Hamid and other senior officials from the Hamas movement. And they're very specific about this, that this would be a requirement for the prisoner exchange, that they would be able to receive prisoners with these very high sentences, and also a guarantee that people would not be re-detained or re-arrested after the release. In 2011, with the other very major prisoner release in exchange for the release of Israeli hostage Shalits, there were about 47, I believe, Palestinians who were released in that deal and then were re-arrested, and they are actually also asking for those who were re-arrested to also be released. So there's specific requirements being put on the release of prisoners in exchange for hostages, some of which have been carried forward from previous rounds of negotiations, and they're being very clear about this. They've presented these demands. They've said that they will remain firm on these demands. This is in rejection of the very vague and temporary proposal that has been put on the table by the US and Israel via the mediators, which really still only specified 6-week truce, did not include a full withdrawal of the occupation forces. It proposed things like reducing aerial reconnaissance for just 8 hours a day, not a full reduction, not a full dismantling of Israeli surveillance on the population of Gaza. It still had restrictions on aid. It had only specified certain amounts of aid. So you can see that Hamas is being very insistent that they're not going to accept these partial proposals that would actually just result in an Israeli administration of Gaza, and that would prepare the ground again for a resumption of the assault on Gaza after that 6-week period. So, when we're talking about a ceasefire, it's really Hamas that is actually proposing the terms for an actual ceasefire, an end to this genocidal war. What is being proposed from the US and Israeli side is just a pause. And that's very significant and very important. It's unclear what's going to happen. Israel has been consistently rejecting these terms. But the US is really feeling the pressure, and they would really like to have at least a pause before the beginning of Ramadan. And now they're even proposing that there's an unconditional truce for just a few days to help achieve some sort of agreed upon deal. So it's a very interesting position. The US is definitely really feeling the heat and is quite frustrated with their own inability to achieve this Israeli proposal.
All right, this is really important, everybody, for people to wrap their head around it, because what the Israelis were basically demanding is that the hostages be released, and in exchange, some Palestinian prisoners would be released. The Israeli Defense Forces would remain in and around Gaza, that they would continue to carry out aerial surveillance to try to pinpoint Hamas positions, undoubtedly, that they would not allow full amounts of humanitarian aid to enter into the Gaza Strip. In other words, that they would be basically having a chokehold over what kind of humanitarian aid comes in. They don't want to release the very important leaders, the people who you mentioned, Barghouti, Sadat, who are leaders of different resistance movements inside of the resistance camp inside of Palestine. So what the Israelis were doing, Layan, and this is what my take on it, and I'll get your take. And I think this is where Biden and the Israelis had something very much in common, but they also have a divergence, because Biden right now is desperate. He's in a corner. He might easily not get reelected. Trump is now beating him in most of the swing states. A lot of pressure. But the Israeli position was, if we kill enough people in Gaza, if we blow up enough homes, if we deprive people of getting food and water, if the starvation level and the mass killing spree reaches such a high level that Hamas, even though it hasn't been militarily uprooted, the Israelis have not succeeded in that Hamas would be compelled to capitulate to the Israeli demands for a ceasefire in order to just stop the suffering of the people in Palestine, the people in Gaza. And what Hamas is basically saying is, no, we're going to resist. We're not going to have all of this damage done to our people, the suffering, the killing, the starvation, the destruction of homes, in order to capitulate to an Israeli demand, which essentially helps limit or even harm in a long-term way the prospects for the Palestinian movement. So Hamas is looking at, and the resistance forces, not just Hamas, looking at it like, what's going on the ground in Gaza? What's their military strength? What's happening to the civilian population? And where do we go from here? Because obviously the operation on October 7th wasn't simply a random act. This is part of a longer-term war of national liberation on the part of Palestinian resistance forces to have a free Palestine. Anyway, all of these complexities all mixed into one, but that's how I see it. We remember Biden, embracing Netanyahu like that right in the beginning. That put him in a corner, and now he's kind of stuck.
Absolutely. And I think it's very important to try to make a distinction between some of these different pressure points. It's quite clear that Israel and Netanyahu are feeling that their best weapon right now is starvation. They are using starvation to try to put pressure on the resistance, on Hamas, to be forced into a corner to accept whatever terms they propose. There's a couple of problems with this, first of all. One is that despite the amount of Israeli media that is trying to paint the Palestinian people that are still in Gaza and that are suffering this famine as feeling upset with the resistance forces, it doesn't really seem to be the case. I mean, people in Palestine, in Gaza, if you look at Arabic media, if you look at some of the more organic messaging that's coming out on social media, and of course it's hard because there's so little access internet and to journalists, many of whom have been assassinated throughout the past 5 months, you really see that the steadfastness of the Palestinian people is not just a slogan. It's not just an idea. It is actually something that is very firm in the consciousness of those who are suffering the worst aspects of this genocide, who are seeing their entire families massacred around them, and who have no access to the basic necessities of life, are still insisting that they don't want to accept terms that would reduce their own access to their own territory. In fact, they're fighting against the colonization of Palestine, and so accepting terms that would just prolong, in a sense, the genocide, perhaps would lessen some of the famine for a period of time, but would not actually remove the occupation from the Gaza territory, is not something that people will accept. And so the attempts by the Israelis, there's been reports that they've been passing out Ramadan boxes, trying to sow discord and create conflict within the Palestinian people, I think are very much overstated by the Israeli media, and it's not as effective as they hope it's going to be. At the same time, it seems that Hamas is quite concerned with the conditions that the people are facing. Of course, Israeli and U.S. media is trying to paint it like Hamas has no concern for the daily life and the conditions of life that the Palestinian people are facing. That's clearly not true. Hamas has been very willing to negotiate and quite flexible in the negotiating process, I think because of this. But they see that the pressure that Israel is trying to use is not as effective. And there's a couple of reasons why that might be. I'm just going to share some of my own analysis on this, but I think it's something that should be debated and discussed further. Partially because the United States finds that this tactic of mass starvation is completely untenable in this moment in time. And that's demonstrated concretely. The US has been airdropping aid, trying to make some sort of spectacle about it, basically sending the message that the mass starvation is not a tactic that's going to be effective. Also, it's true that the Israeli occupation, with all the help from the United States, has not been able to dismantle the resistance yet. And so there's still ability for the Palestinian resistance to insist on certain conditions because they have not been dismantled. Israel has not achieved a victory. It's trying to use starvation as blackmail to basically negotiate a victory. But that has not been effective so far because partially of the position that the United States is in, and also because of the global outrage. You see it in the UN, you see it in the ICJ, you see it in the international arena in all of its forms. People are not accepting that this is just going to go forward as is. There's also the fact that Israel is quite nervous about what's going to happen during Ramadan. There's been attempts to try to negotiate some sort of truce between Lebanon and Israel on the border. The US sent an envoy. There's been some talks. Hezbollah has insisted that as long as the genocide continues in Gaza, they're not going to back down. They haven't escalated. They have responded, but they haven't escalated necessarily. But people are worried. Israelis and the US are quite worried about what might happen during Ramadan if there is a ground invasion on Rafah, and when there is this kind of heightened moment where everyone's going to be in the mosques listening to the plight of the people in Gaza. There's going to be more pressure on people to take action. They're worried about an escalation of a regional war, and really the flashpoint between Lebanon and Israel is could be the tipping point that could actually lead us into really conditions of regional war. There's been, of course, we know what's happening with Yemen and Iraq and Syria, where resistance forces are making concrete actions against US and Israel, but it's been relatively contained as of now. And that's one big fear that the US in particular has, that it could escalate. And I think
No, thank you for that. Ramadan starts on Sunday, March 10th. The Israelis had said they will invade Rafah, full-scale invasion, by March 9th, unless the hostages are released. The ceasefire agreement that the U.S., the Biden administration, and the Israelis have been promoting is one that would have Hamas basically surrender all of the hostages and get a ceasefire? No. Get Israel to leave Gaza? No. Get the release of Palestinian prisoners, especially top leadership that's been unjustly incarcerated? No. So in other words, it's basically you surrender in the name of a ceasefire or we're going to invade. So you have this, that's the Israeli plan, maximum pressure. Then you have on our side, on the side of justice, on the side of the Palestinian people, global mobilizations. You and I were both very involved in the March 2nd mobilization, which was, as I mentioned in the beginning of the show, all over the world. We were telling people now is the time to act. The clock is ticking because you have to take the Israeli threat seriously. And you have all of this starvation in Gaza. And because Hamas was not capitulating, Layan, because they were saying, we want a real ceasefire, we want real peace, we want Israel to leave Gaza, we want, humanitarian aid to come in that won't be stopped constantly by the Israelis. We want people to be able to live and go back to their homes. Because Hamas took that position, and the Israelis called it delusional. That's what Netanyahu called it. He said it was delusional. Then Israel, just yesterday, I believe, basically stopped the UN truck convoy bringing food and medicine to northern Gaza, proving, and a couple days before that, they killed all of those people who were gathered to receive food and other, material necessities for life. They shot them. Then the Israelis blamed the people for running over each other, but the Israelis shot them. This was depriving people of the humanitarian aid is a military strategy. It's not simply cruelty, and it is. And it's not simply barbarism, and it is. It's the military strategy of the Israelis, and the U.S. is kind of complaining about it, but not really, and not that much. But it's designed to put this kind of maximum pressure on Hamas. And so far, Hamas and the Palestinian people, as you're pointing out, the population, who are very political, very highly conscious of all of these things. They're not naive in all. They know what the deal is. And they know that to surrender to Israel under these circumstances doesn't mean peace. It means endless war, actually, against the people of Palestine. But in my mind, that's what explains these latest attacks on the humanitarian aid shipments.
I think you're right, and I think that it's quite clear that the U.S. is complaining, but they're falling short of actually putting pressure on the Israelis to change anything about what they're doing. They've fallen short of cutting any military aid. They're still sending weapons. They're still supporting the Israeli genocide in all actual concrete ways. But I think they're getting a little bit frustrated with this form of maximum pressure strategy. I don't know what you think, Brian. My interpretation of this is that the U.S. is seeing that it's important during the month of Ramadan to buy time. They want to buy time for the Israeli forces to be able to come back in and finish the dismantling of the resistance forces. They haven't been able to achieve that in the past 5 months. It's possible that during the month of Ramadan, there will be an upsurge in uprisings. There's going to be likely, there's been attempts to try to minimize the potential for conflicts around the Aqsa Mosque, but there's historically always been conflicts around access to Aqsa Mosque and Israel's blocking of Palestinian people's right to access this. There will be escalations across the region. The U.S. is concerned about this, and they want to buy Israel time. I think that they are frustrated with their Israeli partners because, in a sense, there's a slight differing of military strategy here. I think, again, this is my analysis. I think that Israel is really feeling that they need to keep putting as much as possible maximum pressure, military might, using every tool they have in their toolbox, including mass famine. The United States has a different kind of approach, especially considering their past decades of failure in the region overall. They really want normalization of relations between different Arab states and Israel. They want to establish a Palestinian state under U.S. terms. They would like a demilitarized, so-called reformed Palestinian Authority to manage Gaza and the West Bank. They want to find some sort of long-term solution that is going to basically lay the groundwork for U.S. hegemony over the region and its resources. Israel has a similar kind of approach. They want to have a long-term solution that would demilitarize the Palestinian resistance, but they don't want a Palestinian state. And there's differing opinions within the Israeli government and the Israeli population. Of course, we've seen a lot of dissonance, including within the war council that Netanyahu set up, which is kind of unprecedented that a war council would actually have such strong disagreements internally. But essentially, the Israeli project is founded on the premise that they have the right to the entire territory of historical Palestine. They're not so interested, like the U.S., in creating a political solution, even though the United States' proposal for a political solution is one that completely takes away Palestinian self-determination and sovereignty. It's not something that the Palestinian people would accept. But to reach that end goal, it needs more of a combination of soft and hard power. And right now, Israel is not willing to engage in that kind of more long-term soft power. I think the United States is used to doing things like dropping massive amounts of bombs and creating huge amounts of destruction and casualties and deaths, and then coming in as the benevolent and the benign and coming in with aid. Israel at this moment is not really engaging in that strategy. They're not so interested in that. They would actually prefer to starve the Palestinian population to death and take over some of the land of Gaza. They want to create a buffer zone. They want to reduce Palestinian mobility. They want to increase the settlements in Gaza. So you see there's some difference in both the U.S. and Israeli strategy here. And I think that's what one of the main tensions is. At the end of the day, both of them are agreed in the fact that they would like a full military victory over the Palestinian resistance. And so there is no real concrete pressure that the U.S. is putting on Israel to stop the genocide. And that's really the main determining factor of the situation right now. And I think is characterizing the mass uprisings against the U.S. and Biden from even within its own borders, many of whom may not be attuned to these kinds of long-term strategies or may disagree on what the future of Palestine should look like. A lot of people who are coming out on the streets are maybe learning about this for the first time. The media blackout on the Palestinian struggle in the United States is decades long. But to Biden's downfall, the majority of the population is quite concerned with ending the genocide as soon as possible and has pretty much come to an agreement that it's a ceasefire that we need, not a temporary solution.
Yeah, even if you know nothing about Palestinian history, Israeli history, but you're watching this destruction of a people and their homes and their children and the mothers of the children, if you're watching that in real time, as people are now, you, in a way, don't need to know that much history to know that something awful is taking place. Just as a human being, people are reacting. So I agree with you that a lot of people in the streets are learning about Palestine and the history as a consequence of their being mortified, horrified, and outraged by the genocide and coming into the movement. And then as they're entering the movement, they want to learn more. And so people are developing Palestine support organizations and movements all over the country, in this country, and I'm sure all over the world. Historically, there are big contradictions that develop between the big colonizers and the little colonizers. And I want to just explain for our audience what I mean. You know, when the British sent colonizers to North America, eventually those colonists developed their own narrow interests, different from the British Empire. And the American Revolution was an example that the colonizing ruling class had a divergence with the big colonizers. So the little colonizers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, they broke free. The same thing happened in Rhodesia, where the racist settler regime in Rhodesia broke free from the main colonizer, and ultimately that was toppled by the revolution in Zimbabwe. Rhodesia is now Zimbabwe. In Haiti, the French Empire went and enslaved the people, enslaved African people and brought them to Haiti. Eventually, the white racist ruling class in Haiti had a divergence with the French monarchy and with the French Republican government. So there are lots of struggles between the big colonizers and the little colonizers. So Britain was the big colonizer, then the United States took over the role of being the big colonizer. The Israeli ruling class are the little colonizers. They have their own interests. Like in North America, they wanted all the territory. Like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, they wanted all of North America. They didn't want just 13 colonies. They used military means and violence and force to get it. So what are the American interests now? What are Joe Biden's interests? Because there, too, there are some contradictions. The U.S. wants Israel to win. They want to destroy the Palestinian resistance. They want to show the people all over the Middle East, we're the boss, and if you ever try to resist, we'll destroy you as we, quote, destroy the Palestinians in Gaza. So they want that. But by not adhering to a U.S. strategy, because Netanyahu and the Israelis are pursuing their own strategy, it's leaving U.S. imperialism and Biden, the political leader, currently the head of state, on the hook. So we see these developing contradictions. Now, undoubtedly, Layan, the Palestinian resistance forces are fully aware of this. There's another contradiction, which is Netanyahu wants the war to go on and on and on and ultimately only claim military victory, because otherwise he's going to lose office and probably go to jail because he's got so many corruption trials. So we have these different sort of ruling class and colonizing sort of interests at play, and some of them are in contradiction. But for our audience and for our movement, what people have to understand is that it's not actually all that confusing. It's not actually that complex. The Palestinian people, the indigenous people, were driven from their homes, from their villages for 75 years, and this is just the latest. And the Palestinian people are determined to fight and to win. And what does winning mean? The Zionist forces say it means they want to kill all Jews. No, they want to have a society, historic Palestine, that is not an apartheid society, where the people who are driven from their homes can return to their homes. I mean, ultimately, the Palestinians know what the struggle is about, and it's very simple and straightforward, and that's what the American people have to really basically understand.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the core of the issue. I think sometimes getting trapped in some of the minutia can distract from the actual root cause of this issue, which is not just a disagreement on particular terms. It is actually an issue of colonization, and that a colonized people are not accepting to be colonized, whether it's by Israel or by the United States. I think that it's particularly significant just to think about what would happen if, for example, Israel goes forward in defiance of U.S. imperialism's long-term strategy and goes forward with a ground invasion in Rafah and really sets them back in what they think is their advances in the quote-unquote day after solution for Gaza, which is this kind of reformed, demilitarized, in name Palestinian-controlled territory, but subservient to the U.S. via some sort of international independent observer. For example, Saudi Arabia has said very clearly, we're not going to normalize relations until there is a Palestinian state with 1967 borders. The United States needs Saudi Arabia. The United States needs to have these normalized relations so that they can manage their larger project of global hegemony now with China on the rise, with Russia asserting defiance in the face of the U.S. Control of economy and resources and setting the terms politically on an international stage. The United States is concerned with the larger scale, and for them, creating more breaks among the different states in the Arab region is actually going to be more of a detriment. They are really invested in this normalization project that they've been, now both the Trump and Biden administration have been pushing forward. And having an increased and full-scale assault on Rafah, increasing the assault on Gaza, and not having something that they can refer to in name as a political solution is going to set them back. This is where it's going to be very interesting, because the United States is being pushed out of the Arab region by forces on the ground outside of Palestine as well. The Iraqi resistance forces, the Syrian resistance forces. Yemen has been taking the world by storm with with the level of resistance that they've been displaying in the face of imperialist aggression. And after this assault on the Yemeni people orchestrated by the United States and Saudi Arabia, that has gone on for many years. It's really, the United States is in a position where they are losing their hold on the region. They've been losing their hold for many years, and that's not in their interest. So either way, both the Israeli and the US solution is one of colonization. The question is of how it's going to look and what shape it's going to take. But the Palestinian people are going to reject colonization, and so are the people of the Arab region. This has been very clear, and it's put pressure on the Arab governments, who have been relatively unwilling to take a position against the United States. There's been a lot of criticism thrown at the Arab governments by their own populations because of this. But just to go back to your opening statement, Brian, this is very important to have clear, that the question is not a question of what form of imperialism or colonization do we want. In fact, the majority of the world does not want colonization at all. And so both the US and Israeli solutions are rejected by both the Palestinian people and now everyone who has been rising up in solidarity with them in all the different forms that has taken.
In 2011, President Obama said, we need to pivot to Asia. Nobody exactly knew what that meant, at least the way it was presented in the media. But what he meant was the U.S. should not be bogged down in losing wars in the Middle East that only have the impact of creating huge amounts of resentment and anger from the people of the Middle East, an inability of the U.S. to win militarily, the inability of the U.S. to create pacified proxy puppet governments, say in Iraq or Libya or elsewhere. We have to pivot to Asia, Obama said, because while we're bogged down in these losing wars, China is not at war, is able to spend its money not on military armaments, but on new technologies for science, new technologies for consumer goods. China's rising. China, a country that was so poor that at the time of the Chinese Revolution, 1 million Chinese died every year from starvation, 1 million a year. And now China is like was at that time in 2011, the second biggest economy, and today is in an aggregate sense, the biggest economy in the world. So here we are, Layan, 13 years after Obama said, let's pivot to Asia. The U.S. is just as bogged down. And like when you think about it from a logical point of view, the U.S. wants to nurture relations with these reactionary Arab regimes that are not progressive, they're reactionary, and they want to do business with the U.S. The U.S. wants to challenge or at least retain the power position that it held for many decades in this resource-rich part of the world in the Middle East. And yet Israel is, in many ways, sort of like a liability, at least in the short term, for the United States. But the U.S. can't break free from its relationship because it sees the Middle East and it sees the Arab world basically from the lens of colonization, which means in order to retain a colonial or neo-colonial type power, you have to show that you have force, you have violence, and that you're willing to use it. And that's the role Israel really plays for the United States. Yes, it's a contradiction. Yes, in some ways it's a liability. But the American ruling class really views Israel as an extension of U.S. imperialist military power in this resource-rich and geostrategically important region. So the U.S. felt on October 7th that when Hamas, crossed the wall and went into the areas that were Palestinian villages up until the time they were exterminated after 1948, the U.S. didn't see this as Hamas trying to reclaim Palestinian land. The U.S. said, this is an attack on us. It was as if Hamas had attacked Long Island or Detroit. And so the idea of complete revenge and retaliation and extinguishing and genocide became like the thing, because that's how empires think. Anyway, this is the horns of the dilemma that imperialism is on right now, U.S. imperialism, and they can't get off of it. The only way they could succeed is if the Palestinian people stopped fighting, or if the Palestinian resistance was completely crushed, and neither of those two options seem to be even remotely on the table at the moment.
Exactly. And I think, in fact, October 7, the success of Hamas's surprise attack on October 7, which included not just taking hostages, but also occupying and going into military bases and going in and taking weaponry. Actually, I think the U.S. saw as very damaging to their image in the region, because it was a huge weakness on the Israeli part. It took them by surprise. There were reports that came out afterwards that showed that the Israelis had received some sorts of tip-offs on this, that they had intelligence that this was coming, that they didn't act on it. It took them, there were images of generals being dragged out in their pajamas, in their underwear. They were completely taken by surprise. And that does a lot to break the image of extreme military power in the region. It gives a lot of hope to people who are under the boot of U.S. military occupation and invasion. And it's not helpful for that strategy of deterrence that you laid out, Brian. It makes an image, the crack in the image of Israeli might and U.S. and Israeli might in the region. And so I think that the response, the genocidal response, in a sense, this constant bombardment and mass killing, massacres, total inhumane genocide, is in a sense to try to erase the image of October 7, in which a small and occupied people were able to attack and achieve a victory against the greatest military might in the world, the US and Israel combined. That's really bad for the policy of deterrence that the United States has relied on to maintain power and control in the region. The other thing that they rely on is this aid. It's this image of themselves as the source of what people need to have a peaceful and happy life. The image there is also being broken. They haven't been able to deliver aid. They're not able to, because of the Israeli blocks and the US-backed Israeli blocks on the distribution of aid in Gaza. They haven't been able to reposition themselves as the benign kind of referee of international conflict, which they would hope to maintain and to have. It's totally cracked. Their image, their legitimacy has been severely threatened. This is now multiple times that the Israeli forces have suffered defeats. Lebanon in 2006 is another example. And so I think that's another reason why an escalation with Lebanon is another huge threat to the U.S.-Israeli project. They can't keep suffering these defeats, even though they have the greater military might on their side and they're able to do these kinds of mass killings. Still, their image of control and ultimate control over the region has been threatened many times, and it has definitely given more confidence to people who are struggling against colonialism and imperialism across the world.
Layan, I'm glad you put it in some of the historical perspective. Israel has this gigantic military. The U.S. has given Israel $330 billion over the last decades. The U.S. gives Israel more military and economic aid than any other country in the world. Again, as we were talking about, it sees Israel as an extension of American power in a resource-rich, geostrategic part of the world. It probably hoped that Israel and Saudi Arabia could handle U.S. interests and the U.S. could pivot to Asia. But the spirit and the struggle of the Palestinian people is such that this struggle can't be extinguished. I mean, in 1987, there was the first Intifada. That lasted for 4 years, where it was the grassroots. It was the political organizations. The Palestinians had no army, no air force, no navy. It was the masses of people. And the Israeli government had the breaking bones strategy. It was trying to, meaning it would grab people and just literally hold them and break their arms and legs. It shot people dead. It incarcerated thousands of people. But the people wouldn't stop fighting. At a certain point, every battle ebbs or ends, but in each case, the next battle starts when it comes to the Palestinian people. What's going on in Gaza since October 7th is not the last battle. We don't know how this will end. Nobody knows. But it won't be the last battle because this quest for freedom and justice isn't going to stop. You mentioned Ramadan. And this is what the U.S. really fears. It's not Ramadan because it's an Islamic holiday. It's because Ramadan can provide the basis, the material basis, the organizational basis for large numbers of people congregating together, working together, and using this month-long religious period to raise the resistance levels against what the Israelis and the Americans have done to the people of Gaza. That's what Biden is afraid of. He's afraid of two things. One, you can see he's become isolated in the United States, and he will lose re-election to Donald Trump, who, is just as bad or worse than Biden when it comes to Israel and the Palestinian people. But people don't want and won't vote for Biden when he's perpetrating and partnering with genocide. So Biden is worried about that. But the U.S. ruling class is more worried that another intifada, another resistance, could spread from the West Bank, from Jerusalem, go into Lebanon, into Iraq, into Yemen, all over the region. And when you have hundreds of millions of oppressed Arab people and other oppressed peoples from the Middle East who are recognizing Ramadan, who also are standing with the Palestinian people, the potential combustibility of the moment can't be overstated. And the U.S. imperialist forces, including Biden, they know this. They know it. So they're caught. I think what's most important for people in the United States, we're trying to provide perspective and analysis, but what's most important for people here is to not be observers and wait and watch and see what happens during Ramadan somewhere else, but people need to stay in the streets. People need to be disrupting the politicians. Biden officials can't go anywhere, and Biden actually can't campaign anywhere without being disrupted by people who are outraged about Gaza. This was just like it was with American officials in 1969 during the Vietnam War. They could not go out and speak to the American people without getting disrupted. We're at that level. So we're at this critical historical juncture. It looks awful. I mean, the starvation, the hunger, the killing, the death, the displacement of the Palestinian people in Gaza it's horrifying. And yet at the same time, because it's a living and dynamic struggle, it can lead to another era or epoch where the struggle for justice against apartheid and against occupation can reach new heights. So the question really is for people who are not in Gaza, not in Palestine, not in the Middle East, what is it that we can do? So as we go out, I want to just ask you, you're part of the Shut It Down for Palestine Coalition. You've been a premier leader of it. March 2nd, as we talked about, millions in the streets. What's coming next?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. This is not the time to step away from the streets. This is the time to increase the mobilization, bring more people into the movement, and keep putting pressure and building the mass movement that has already grown exponentially over the past couple of months. The desperation that we're witnessing on Biden's front He can't campaign. Now he's suggesting that there's a couple of days of unconditional just truce because he's really desperate to be able to say that he achieved something before he has to go on to national television and do the State of the Union address and then continue with his electoral campaign. This is the time to really increase and make sure that it is felt that his own population is in complete rejection with the policies that he's putting forward. It can have a huge impact, and it already has. Imagine what you're laying out, Brian, is extremely important. What's going to happen in this phase of the battle is hard to predict. We're going to have to wait and see. It's going to be determined by the struggle on the ground. But what we can't ignore is that Israel and the United States have already suffered a major defeat in the arena of public opinion. So as the Palestinian struggle continues, it has not been extinguished. It has only been nourished more, and now there's more young people, not only in Palestine and across the world, who identify with the Palestinian cause, who see the righteousness of it, who see the dignity of the demands, and who are joining into the struggle. Now, whatever goes forward after this phase of the battle, if there is another uprising, if there are any further developments, U.S. and Israel are going to be it's going to be really difficult for them to use their usual playbook and say the Palestinians are terrorists, the Palestinians are the ones who are violating basic human rights. It's going to be very difficult for them to use that narrative to position themselves and suppress the movement in solidarity with Palestine. The conditions now for what the U.S. administration can do are completely changed without suffering consequences in the arena of public opinion. We have flipped the script. People are now on consensus that it's actually Israel and the United States that are carrying out terrorist attacks against the people of Palestine. And so going forward, that's going to be a major factor. It's extremely important now after March 2, which was really amazing and unprecedented in the number of mobilizations and people who came out. Just New York alone, it was pouring rain. It was absolutely pouring. Everyone was soaked through. And there still was 50,000 people out. The march was over a mile long, taking up an extremely wide avenue of New York City. And New York City is one of the bastions of Zionism in the United States. There's a lot of people who go to settle and build settlements on Palestinian territory come from New York. Major institutions that fund and develop Zionist institutions on the Israeli side have headquarters here in New York City. This is not insignificant. And even with the pouring rain, you had massive numbers of people. And also with the increase in police repression over the past couple of weeks and months, this is a major sign that the popular base for the Zionist project and for the Israeli state is completely destroyed. And the United States is going to be very limited in what it can do without triggering massive uprisings among its own people. We need to make sure that message is clear and that we continue to put pressure in this critical moment where every day the negotiations are developing and are changing. We want this genocide to end. We want the Palestinian people to be able to eat, to live in dignity, to rebuild. We want the struggle to be furthered. And this is shared in the popular consciousness of people now in the United States. It's really, really dramatic. It's really unprecedented. We're in a moment that feels like a historical turning point. And those people who think that they can execute genocide and get away with it are very much mistaken and are definitely feeling the heat right now. And so looking forward, we're going to be continuing to mobilize throughout the month of Ramadan. We are going to be sending a very clear message. Even people who do not observe Ramadan, who are not Arab or Muslim, a lot of people have been activated in this moment and are ready to continue mobilizing in the next couple of weeks. March 2 was a signifier of that, and so what's to come, I think, will be even more.
Yeah, and I want to encourage people to go to the website Shut It Down for Palestine, and it's the number 4, shutitdownforpalestine.org. International Women's Day is coming up on March 8th. It'll be recognized as it is every year by women and progressive forces all around the world. This year, International Women's Day means standing with Palestine, and I know there will be major actions in New York City and around the United States, and I'm sure around the world. Layan, people go shutitdownforpalestine.org. You also have volunteers meetings that happen every Monday night at the People's Forum. If you're hearing this show and you have been not involved so far, you haven't gotten involved, get involved. Go to that website, Shut It Down for Palestine, come to a demonstration. And if you have been involved, let's keep it going, because what we do here will make a difference. The politicians are fully aware that the American people have turned. The issue now is, are we able to keep it up, maintain and intensify the pressure? Layan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, and see you all in the streets.